Yo, this hot, this the spot, there it is, pod.com. We're interviewing the best comedians, so tune in quick and get your ears receiving them. We talking about life and life to stream right to you, from the microphone right to your home, dude. Side note, this might get embarrassing, but no, don't sweat, yo, cause there it is.
Welcome to the There It Is podcast, a comedy podcast to help you find your inspiration. I'm your host, Jason Barr. Let's do this. Great episode for you today. We have Tavish Forsyth on. I'm very excited to share that episode with you. But before we get to that, I do want to just mention a couple of things that's been going on. Finally went to a live comedy show for the first time in well over a year now last night, and it was great. Went to Littlefield here in Brooklyn and saw Gary Goldman and a bunch of other funny comics perform, and I think Gary Goldman was one of the last, if not the last, shows that I saw before the shutdown. He's so great. He's still so great. He looks like Frank Zappa now because he's grown out the facial hair a little bit, and his hair is longer. He looks like Frank Zappa. And it was great. It was really fun seeing a show again. And Littlefield is a great venue. I've seen Joe Firestone there. I've seen North Coast there. Really great venue. But here's an awesome thing going on, because I know many of you are not in New York City. Many of you are not even in the U.S. And by the way, if you're in another country, thank you so much for listening. I didn't really ever anticipate that when I started this podcast, and it's really cool that there are people that are listening outside of America. So, hey, thanks. But wherever you are, there are a lot of these shows that are also being live streamed. So there are live shows happening at like Bell House and Littlefield, two really great venues in Brooklyn, New York. And it'll be like $12, $15 for a ticket live, but they'll also just charge like $5 for a live stream ticket. I highly suggest that you do that because, then when I was in South Carolina and just seeing on social media all these shows that were happening up here, I was saying, I just had FOMO like crazy. And now there's access to these shows. So I strongly suggest you check those out so you can go to Littlefield or the Bell House. And I don't know if like Comedy Cellar or any place like that is doing it, but just look online, see who's doing that, see who has a live stream option, and check out these shows. And maybe there are even other states doing it. Like if there's something going on in Portland or LA or somewhere, check out shows. I think it'd be dope to support these venues that are in other places because they really got hit in this last year. Okay, today's guest is Tavish Forsyth. Tavish is a trained actor with 2 degrees in theater, and he has studied at the Baltimore Improv Group, the Powerhouse Theater, and IO Theater, and he is the founder of Bird City Improv. And we got connected because of previous guest, Brian James O'Connell. He just suggested that we talk, and this is honestly one of my favorite discussions that I've had on here, and it flowed really well. Tavish is awesome, very insightful, very thoughtful, and very funny and sweet, and I just loved him. And I really, really enjoyed talking to him. And this starts in a very interesting way. He had a Star Trek The Next Generation background on his Zoom, and I was like, oh, is that Next Generation? Which I don't even know that much about Star Trek, but I recognize that. And we started talking about that, and then it just sort of naturally went into the interview. So we drop right in here, and stay till the end because he shares something that I really appreciated at the very end of the conversation. So here's my chat with Tavish Forsyth. I don't know much about Star Trek. My brother is the one who knows about Star Trek. And I recognize that as Next Generation. However, I don't know enough about the others, except for the first one, to have, I saw that and was like, oh, Next Generation. But then I thought, I guess that could be Deep Space Nine or Voyager. I don't really know.
Yeah, all the ones in the 90s have a very similar aesthetic, which as a Star Trek nerd, I appreciate. Like, it's very clear, like the crossover. It doesn't feel like, like some like franchises will exist in the same universe, but one movie will feel like a totally different universe than the other movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally know. That's one of the things my brother will sort of nitpick about some of these things. Like the continuity is so off from the newer productions. It seems.
Yeah, the newer stuff is bizarre to me. Some of it is okay, but most of it just feels like I don't know, like the directors of Fast and the Furious got their hands on Star Trek or something. Like something went wrong at Paramount, and I don't know what.
Didn't Justin Lin do one of the Star Trek movies?
I don't know who Justin Lin is.
I think he is a fan. We only just saw the 40 minutes of the first Fast and Furious movie the other day, and we're only watching them for kind of ironically, so we can laugh at the ridiculousness of that universe, because it gets really insane. I've heard a few friends laugh about that universe, but one the other day was telling us how the first one is just about busting people who were stealing DVDs and DVD players or something like that.
Let's go for a little ride.
What the hell is that all about?
A business deal that went sour. Plus, I made the mistake of sleeping with his sister.
And then you take the last movie, and it's super powered humans and all this sort of random ridiculous.
Damn, he really is Black Superman.
It's how did this universe come out of a movie that was about trying to bust these street racers who were just moving product illegally?
Right. Yeah. And it probably I haven't seen them, but I assume that when they made the first one, they didn't have the whole series mapped out. So then for them, it's just this act of continually heightening and sort of improvising their way through the franchise.
People like this, let's just double down on that for the next movie. Yeah.
Right.
And it's really funny. But I think the third recent Star Trek movie, there was J.J. Abrams had two, and I think the third one was directed by someone who I believe has directed a Fast and Furious movie. I feel like I've only heard his name mentioned in regards to those.
Interesting. I thought I was just making that up, to be sort of shady towards
but I think it's actually
it's. I'm laughing a little bit, but also I feel a little angered that is the actual truth.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, my brother has gotten real angered with this stuff. I don't know if you pay any attention to the red letter media, but those guys hate what the universe has become, because I think they stopped watching Picard because it was just flying in the face of so much of what the Next Generation was about. So they were just they really changed all the characters, and it's really bad.
Star Trek Picard is the most disappointing thing since Star Trek Discovery.
Please evaluate the show on its merits. Everyone has worked so hard and given so much love to this thing.
Shut the fuck up.
This thing is being born of love. Please give it a chance.
This is for him.
Star Trek Picard is neither Star Trek nor Picard.
It's different, and it's not all good.
So I can empathize.
I will say I watched Picard. That's I had distanced myself from the franchise, but I came back for Picard, and I did like it. They definitely took liberties. It definitely is not the same show, right? Because now, instead of living in a utopian future, it's a dystopian future. So that feels like a really
that's a thumb in the eye there
about Star Trek, right? Because the whole idea is we've evolved past war, we've evolved past hunger, and now we're just exploring and just seeing what the ins and outs of cultural exchange are.
Right.
And then each episode ended up being this morality play about cultural exchange. I mean, some of them would be like a whodunit. Some of them might be a love story, but most of them are these like morality plays, which I found really interesting as a younger person.
Second start of the ride. And straight on till morning.
Set a course. For home.
I'm reading an ion storm on that trajectory, sir. Should I go around it?
We can't be afraid of the wind, Ensign. Take us to Warp 4.
It is the unknown that defines our existence. We are constantly searching, not just for answers to our questions, but for new questions. We are explorers. We explore our lives, day by day. And we explore the galaxy, trying to expand the boundaries of our knowledge. And that is why I am here. Not to conquer you with weapons or with ideas, but to coexist and learn.
Let's see what's out there. Engage.
Yeah. So they sort of like dropped that format a little bit.
Unmitigated disaster.
Sheer fucking hubris.
I saw you sitting back in your very fine chateau. Yeah, I'd show you around my estate, but it's more of a hovel, so that would just be, humiliating.
But I will say, I liked Picard, and I liked that they made 7 of 9 queer. I thought cool. That was 7 of 9 is like this.
Is that Jerry Ryan's character?
Jerry Ryan's character from Voyager.
That's all I know.
She was one of the Borg. Like she was assimilated into this like cybernetic zombie race.
This is where I was assimilated. Papa tried to fight them, but they were too strong. I tried to hide. Maybe they wouldn't find me because I was little. They did.
Mm-hmm. And it was this really powerful metaphor for surviving abuse. Mm-hmm. And it was a really great theme and sort of storyline that lasted multiple seasons throughout Star Trek Voyager. And I just loved that they brought her character back, and I loved how her character evolved.
After they brought you back from your time in the collective, do you honestly feel that you regained your humanity?
Yes.
All of it?
No. But we're both working on it, aren't we?
Every damn day of my life.
And I thought it was amazing that she was openly queer, and it wasn't like a thing, it wasn't like, now I'm going to come out of the closet. It was just sort of like it happened. It's in the past, but like it's very clear that you were in this relationship with this person. And that felt great because they're, despite Star Trek being in this like utopian, inclusive, supposedly future, there's no queer people.
Yeah. That is interesting, and that's because people at the time making it were either against sharing that or couldn't for whatever reason, or maybe even afraid to share it because of where the world was, where society was at that time.
Why no gay characters? George Takei, who played Sulu, says that he asked Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry for a gay crew member, but Gene told him that the interracial kiss had nearly doomed the series, so a gay character would never make it to air. At a fan convention in 1986, Gene told the audience, "We should show gay people on board the Enterprise." That's according to David Gerrold, who was at the event with Gene. David took Gene at his word and wrote an episode called Blood and Fire. It was just a fleeting reference. Riker was to ask one of them, "How long have you two been together?" and one would reply, "Since the Academy." But there was an outcry behind the scenes. According to David, producer Rick Berman freaked out, as did Gene's lawyer, Leonard Maslish. They made David go through rewrite after rewrite on the episode, but it was never enough. Eventually, he and the show parted ways on harsh terms, and with him went the best chance of getting gays on the Enterprise.
Yeah. one of the interesting things we could never talk about improv and only talk about Star Trek. I'm willing to, but last thought on the queerness in Star Trek was there were a few episodes from the 90s, like capsule episodes, where they did address gender nonconformity and they did address queerness and even transgender topics as well, which
occasionally among my people there are a few who are born different, who are throwbacks from the era when we all had gender. Some have strong inclinations to maleness, and some have urges to be female. I am one of the latter.
I have to admit, I had a feeling you were different.
These feelings are forbidden. Those who are discovered are shamed and ridiculed, and only by undergoing psychotectic therapy and having all elements of gender eliminated can they be accepted into society again.
You are aware of the charges against you?
Yes?
Do you intend to dispute them?
I am tired of lies. I am female. I was born that way. It is not unnatural. I am not sick because I feel this way. I do not need to be helped. I do not need to be cured. We have not injured you in any way. And yet we are scorned and attacked. And all because we are different. All of the loving things that you do with each other, that is what we do. And for that we are called misfits and deviants. What right do you have to punish us? What right do you have to change us? What makes you think you can dictate how people love each other?
The one thing I don't understand is why Dax and Lenara can't just pick up where they left off.
Even if they do harbor feelings for each other, it's strictly against the rules of Trill society for them to acknowledge it. Having a relationship with a lover from a past life is called a reassociation, and the Trill feel very strongly that it's unnatural.
I don't want to do anything to hurt you.
I knew the risks. I went into it with my eyes wide open.
And what about now? Are your eyes open? Do you know what the risks are?
I thought I'd gotten over you. And now I know I haven't.
I've missed you. I've missed you so much. I don't know what to do, Benjamin.
What do you want to do?
Throw myself at her. Profess my undying love and my complete disregard for Trill society. You don't think I should pursue this, do you?
No.
Okay. Why?
Because I remember what Curzon used to say about reassociation. That it didn't matter whether he agreed with the taboo or not, because the price for violating it was too high. Exile. I know this is difficult for you. I know how you feel about Lenara. But I want you to think about what will happen if you pursue this. If you're exiled from Trill, there will be no further hosts for your symbiont when Jadzia dies. Dax dies.
I know that. But I also know I love her, Benjamin.
But if you're sure, if this is what you really want, I will back you all the way.
Why not do the work here with me?
The two of us together, you know what that would mean.
I know exactly what that would mean. But I think it's worth the price.
That's the tricky part, though, isn't it? Living with the consequences. I want to be with you more than anything, but I don't think that I can do this.
After all this time we're together, don't throw that away. I don't want to! If you feel about me the way I feel about you, you won't go on that transport tomorrow.
Those sort of like episodes were amazing, but like it was the way that it was framed was kind of like, this is an extraordinary moment that is not like part of our central arc. like none of our characters are going to be queer, and we're never going to talk about it except for these moments. But progress happens very glacially sometimes.
Yes. A lot of the things that you're talking about, all these layers that you are bringing out of Star Trek, ones that, because I didn't watch it as much, didn't pick up on, it's really showing why you're an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins, right?
That's right. Yeah.
You have a couple of degrees in theater. But let's go back a little bit. Are you from Maryland?
I grew up in New Hampshire. I was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is a small city outside of Boston. But most of my childhood and teenage years were spent in New Hampshire. And in 2011, I moved to Maryland, to Baltimore County, to study theater and film and English. And then I stuck around. I stuck around because I really liked the improv scene in Baltimore. I got exposed to the improv scene in Baltimore.
Okay. And so you didn't do improv before that?
Did I do improv before that?
Right.
Like in high school, we did like Freeze, but it was the worst.
Yeah.
And that isn't just like my teenage drama club trauma speaking. It was like, it was just the worst, right? There was no explanation of like concept or like, here's how you improvise well. It was just like a bunch of like really nervous, pubescent drama nerds clapping their hands and screaming for like 10 minutes. Yeah. So that was my experience with improv before.
Yeah. So I had a similar experience, but in college, where it was sort of like, this isn't exciting me about the idea of improv. But later you got into it. And so you're saying in college was when you really got into improv.
Yeah, it was a prerequisite course or required course for my major. And at first I took this class with this improviser named Bruce Nelson, who has been doing improv for quite a long time in the Baltimore area. And I liked it. I liked it a lot. I liked it enough to take another class. There was an elective kind of like advanced improv class. And that teacher, Joe Brady, was a alumni from IO and had us read Truth and Comedy, and also suggested like improvised Scene from the Inside Out and the UCB manual. And so it was around that time where I think like I really got hooked, because really the idea of yes and I just felt was very very liberating for me. It helped me come out of the closet, which is no small thing. And it helped me with some other things and other challenges and discoveries that I made in my 20s as well. But definitely it was that second class. And you know what it was? He, as an assignment, said, go to Baltimore and watch an improv show and write an essay on it, which I wasn't particularly excited about. But I went and my mind was blown. My mind was blown at like how good I don't even remember like what the scene was, any of the scenes, but I just remember laughing and thinking like this was surprisingly great. And it was just on the second floor of a bar. Like it wasn't in like some amazing venue. And that made me think that there's a there. There's something about this. So between that and coming out, I was like, okay, let me try to keep this in my repertoire. And then over the years, I sort of gradually shifted away from scripted material and more towards improv until 2018, where I was like, you know what, this is what I'm going to do exclusively. The script be damned. So yeah, I don't really touch scripts that often. I'm still interested. Like I love writing. I would do a scripted play again if I felt like it spoke to me on a really visceral and spiritual level. but I haven't seen that script yet. In the meantime, improv gives me all of those feelings and more.
You and if you don't want to go into it, that's totally fine. But there was something interesting you said about improv helping you come out.
Yeah.
How did that have that impact on you? Like, in what ways do you mean that?
Well, I think queer people are constantly being gaslit into thinking that their identity is not okay. Even if, as with my case, I wasn't living, and I'm very thankful for this, I didn't grow up in a home that was gay bashing. You know, my family was not part of the evangelist right, and was not going around saying like, I'm thinking about swearing here, dropping some slurs, and I don't want to do that on your podcast.
You can do it.
But they're not saying that queers are going to go to hell, right? They're not saying that. And I was very thankful for that. But, you know, it's in the media, it's in the messaging. There's like microaggressions out the wazoo. There's bullying in high school. And, you know, even if your parents say something like, there's nothing wrong with gay people, there's still so many other homophobic things that they end up saying sort of unknowingly.
Well, yeah, but, and even, not to cut you off, but even just saying, well, there's nothing wrong, it's like they're still commenting on something. They never say that about being straight.
Yes.
I've literally heard one person my entire life say that being straight is not being moral. One person. That is not a topic of conversation otherwise, because people have normalized straightness.
Right.
But anything else is other, and that is inherently dismissive of queer people, and that is a problem.
Yes. And most people don't think about it in such a complex and nuanced way, and we really need to. And that seemingly good-natured but still problematic way of thinking about queerness reminds me of this Seinfeld episode where one of the guest characters is gay, and it's sort of like a recurring bit. Like every time it comes up, there's a laugh line, and there's this catchphrase throughout the episode where every character says, not that there's anything wrong with that.
Jerry, did you wash this pit?
Yeah, I washed it.
It looks like it hasn't been washed.
So wash it.
You hear the way he talks to me?
You should hear how my boyfriend talks to me.
What? We're not gay. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, of course not.
I mean, I have many gay friends.
My father's gay.
Yeah, that's the one where
there's anything wrong with that. And,
Jerry.
And I remember loving that episode. I loved that episode when I was younger. And my family loved that episode too, and they would say it a lot. Or on the TV show Friends, which I also used to really like. In almost every single episode, Ross or Chandler, Joey's masculinity is called into question. Their sexual orientation is called into question. It's always the laugh line.
I was in the shower, and as I was cleansing myself, I felt something.
Was it like a sneeze, only better?
It's not visually accessible to me, and I was hoping maybe you guys could help me out.
Whoa!
Look, Ross, why don't you just go see it?
Okay, well, it's definite. 2 more weeks of winter.
Yeah,
right.
What happened? I don't know. You fell asleep. That is all.
I better go.
Yeah, I think that would be best.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
Okay, but not about this.
No, never. Never.
Not to mention the fact, like the other problematic things happening with Friends, right? Which we could go into, but I don't really want to. Anyway, so there was this big part of me that was just really repressed and in denial about who I was and what I wanted. And I think just reading about Yes and having it explained to me, and then also having the experience of really activating it and embodying it on stage and realizing that when you're in a scene, this is what you got. You need to accept it. You need to affirm your experience. You need to affirm the other person's experience and then try to make the most of it. And it was like a light bulb went off in my head. And I remember thinking, like, I don't want to die, right? I don't want to live the rest of my life continuing to say no to this part of me that I want to explore. And so that was kind of like the first brick in a wall of internal homophobia, or internalized homophobia that fell and is still falling. Most of it's gone, but those traumas can be deep.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's something that a lot of people in our society don't realize, because I experience it in my way as a black man who's brought up in the South, and there is a lot of internalized self-hatred that can come from just the way the world, what was normal, what was quote unquote treated as standard normal, was being a white person, but specifically a white male, straight, wife and kids, but you're the leader. That's what's normalized. And that stuff still, those sort of ideas still exist today. And it's not just like this big, like a KKK member sort of way that it exists. It's still like within our system. And that has affected queer people, that has affected people of color, and that's affected women. And so there is this unlearning that we individually have to do, but there's also an unlearning that our society has to do as well. But that stuff is so internalized that it's hard to pinpoint in the moment, and it's hard to reckon with, I guess, for a lot of people. But obviously there's a greater need to overcome that difficulty, and just so that we can address it appropriately.
Yeah. And I think it's just this continual sort of internal work that marginalized people need to do, in not only like self-acceptance and accepting that, like, yes, this is how I grew up. Yes, this is what I taught. Yes, this is how other people behaved around me, or this is how I behaved. There's this, I'm trying to think how to put it. I'll give an example. Maybe that will help me a little. Like, I think of like when I first started going through puberty, that's when I started being very, aware of my body and other people's bodies and how certain bodies made me feel. And it also made me like very keenly aware of, gender role differences. And I remember like making a very conscious effort to walk down the hall in a very masculine machismo kind of way. I remember making a very conscious effort not to sway my hips as I walked. And I don't even know if I swayed my hips a lot before then. I just knew that if I did that thing, that I might be teased. Some people would call me out. They'd say, "Oh, you sound gay," if I speak with a little bit of a higher pitched voice or a little bit more of a sing-songiness in my voice. And I was very conscientious of that. So I tried to intentionally like lower my voice. And when you try to do that and you do it so well that it goes on autopilot, that when you do discover or you start to accept this other side of yourself and you start to be a little bit more identity conscious, culture conscious, community conscious, and maybe you want to start transforming your self-concept, right? The image of who you think you are. You want to transform that not only for other people, but specifically for you, right? So like as a queer person, and this has sort of been like the journey of my 20s is realizing like beyond just me being sexually attracted to men. Like, what does it mean for me to be queer just in my presentation, in my behavior, in terms of like gender expressiveness? And so it's been very like for instance, moving my hands with like great gestures, or like allowing myself to, get a little higher pitched. Because I think like back in the day, if you were to talk to me and I was still closeted and you would just come up, I would speak down here, and I would make sure not to. I think even like my facial expression would be less animated. I'd be very like stone faced. I would never cross my legs. And I don't like doing any of that. I love crossing my legs. I love talking with my hands. I love snapping and clapping and having a high pitched voice or squealing in public or like whatever. Like I just love being that part of me. But there's still so many times of the day or times of the week where maybe I'm out in public or talking to someone and I realize that I unconsciously kind of like code switch back into that safer, more heteronormative person that I once strived to be. And then like I sort of have like this internal feeling of like guilt or shame. Like, why did I do that? Like, why did I feel incapable, or why did I feel like I need to conform to what this other person expects of me to make them feel comfortable and to make me feel safer? And did I really need to do that? Like, was my safety actually in jeopardy? Or was it just me kind of like flexing my ability to access cisgender privilege, my ability to access heteronormative privilege because I can? But maybe like that doesn't necessarily, just because I can doesn't mean I necessarily want to, or that is necessarily the most authentic version of me that I want to present. And so I guess in summation, what I'm saying is that it is not just like you have this realization once of like, wow, I grew up in a culture that was predominantly straight, or wow, I grew up in a culture that was predominantly white, and my identity was not really represented, or my community was not well thought of in the culture in which I was raised. That is not a realization that happens once. It's a realization that continues to happen because of our external experiences. And then it sort of like forces us to be really like introspective for a second.
I, for one, really appreciate you sharing that. And I am seeing a lot in my experience because there is that code switching, and there is a lot of questioning your own presentation. Like that, at least that's the experience I had, because growing up in the 90s when thug rappers is what everyone thought being black was. Right. Even black people pushed that narrative. And, if you weren't presenting like that, then people would actually say like, oh, you act white, or something like to that effect. And it's like, have you seen a person from Chicago, a black person from Chicago? Because they act a lot more like me than like thug rappers from Brooklyn.
I smoke all the like smoking Joe Frazier, the Hellraiser, raising hell with the flavor.
So it has nothing to do with what they do or their skin color. It has to do with where they're from. People like these rappers were acting the way they act because they're from New York City. They were acting that way because they were black. And then you can look, and also you just go back in time, you look at black people from Harlem in the Harlem Renaissance. They were still more like me than they were like some rapper from Harlem or something like that. So it really started making me think like, well, I feel black and I feel like I represent that. And it's only been recently that you hear people say like there are many different ways to be black, but people weren't saying that when I was an impressionable kid. And it messed with my head. And I still, especially now, when I look back and I just see how effed up it really was, it just makes me resent a lot of things from before, because I wasn't wrong. and the way I was being and the way I felt about who I was as a person. And I didn't need to be different to be black. And I hated that I ever felt that way. It's really frustrating, especially when it like comes down to something as stupid as the race of the musician you're listening to. Like it was honestly, I mean, like, you know, if I told someone in the 90s I listened to Sting, then they'd be like, oh, that's not white to do. I mean, that's not very black to do. But then you have like, you go back and look at Eddie Murphy in 48 Hours singing Roxanne by the Police. You know, it's like, well, are we going to really say now? You know, or like, I don't know. Yeah. It's just really obnoxious. And then you have like people like Rick Rubin who produced and like made the beats for all these hip hop songs that were influencing hip hop in general. And the influence he had on rap is pretty high. And then like some beats that have been sampled were played by white musicians. So it's like, how can we say what is black or white based on music when it's all so like connected, right? So, you know, there is a lot of, like, I mean, I don't want to say neuroses, but something that gets us in our heads about who we are as people based on just like what society and culture puts on us to feel when they're the ones who are wrong.
Yeah. I don't think it's too great of a word to say neuroses, right? I mean, that's oppression is the cruel and unjust treatment of either a person or a group of people. And that cruel and unjust treatment isn't just physical violence, although it often comes in that form. It's also psychological violence and psychological abuse. And that includes microaggressions. I was reading recently how microaggressions is kind of like a poor word for what it is, right? Because a microaggression is psychological trauma. And I suppose you could analogize it to a paper cut if you want, right? As opposed to being like hit in the head with a hammer. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. But that doesn't change the fact that it is hurting you. It's causing you to bleed. And when there is a dominant culture that is not inclusive, that does not see the dignity and humanity and diversity within the subcultures or within the non-dominant culture, that is going to cause neuroses. And I actually think it's a two-way neuroses too. I don't think it's just like neuroses of the people who are oppressed, the people that have been victimized by trauma, abuse, and oppression. I also think it's on the side of the oppressors as well. I think when you look at someone and you can't see them as an individual, or when you look at a culture and you can't see that culture or that community as unique and diverse and textured, then there is something neurotic about you. And I hope I understand, like, we don't like using the word neurotic could be labeled like ableist perhaps, and I hope that is not my intention in using that word. And if anyone's hearing this,
how I took it,
like, wow, this guy sounds really ableist right now, I am sorry, but I do think there is something psychologically harmful about and it's a two-way street.
Absolutely. There was something you mentioned a few minutes ago about how you haven't really touched scripts because they haven't, and I'm somewhat putting words in your mouth, but they just haven't had the deeper impact on you that you would like a script to give you before you embark on trying to act it out. Does that mean that you are getting that sort of emotional, deep impact through improv? Are you exploring things deeper? I get that impression that you must if you have conversations that are as deep as the one that you're presenting now.
Yes. Yeah. So I love dramatic improv. I love social justice and socially conscious improv. And I love being emotive and vulnerable in improv scenes. And I also love improv comedy, and I love game. And I love wacky characters. And I also don't think that the two need to be separate. When I teach dramatic improv, I always tell my students that, some people hear dramatic improv and they think tragic improv, right? Like every single scene that we're about to see needs to be
the saddest thing,
super traumatic and super tragic. It doesn't need to be. Drama is just theatrical storytelling, and that can include tragedy and comedy. And I think they coexist really well together, like yin and yang. So if I do comedy, and I really like doing duos. I like being on stage just like with one other person for like at least 20 minutes. Because you can find all of those comedic moments, but you can also find these moments where you could hear a pin drop, because we're talking about something real and moving, and it does fill me with that exhilaration that I don't often get from theater. Yeah,
that's very interesting. Obviously you can get it in reading a script, but by the time that's on stage, it might be a little harder for it to have that same impact, because you've been delving into that script so much, and rehearsing the lines so much. But I guess with a show, an improv show, you're able to delve into it in the moment. That vulnerability can be there every time you perform, because you don't know what's coming next, and you don't know how you're going to be affected next.
Right. One of the questions that I hear a lot when doing scripted theater, like especially on the first day of rehearsal when there's like a table read, is why here, why now? Why are we doing this play right here? Why are we doing this play right now? And I think the answers that people give often feel like bullshit to me. Like I don't really think there is a reason why we need to be doing Hamlet right now and right here, no matter how you're deciding to cast or play with gender in it, or I don't know, the way that you're changing the ending. Like none of that feels super relevant to, I think, this current moment that we're in.
And maybe it's because they decided to do the play before they thought about what was needed here and now.
Exactly. And I think that happens a lot in the world of scripted theater, especially with regional theaters, because they have a subscriber base that is predominantly white and 50 plus. And so they want to see musicals that they saw 30 years ago and plays that they saw 30 years ago. And so even when a theater company is doing something a little bit more contemporary, and perhaps even about a really important topic, it still feels dated and a little irrelevant. There is this play. Oh, I'm such a bad gay person for not remembering what it's called. It's by Larry Kramer. It's about the AIDS crisis. And it's a phenomenal play, right? It's beautiful. And at the time it shined a light on a misunderstood part of American society. The queer social justice movement has evolved since that time. Right. And so but I still see many theaters producing this play. Not that it is important to stay updated on history. And I think there is something to gain from staging a more historical piece of theater. But you need to remember that every time you choose to produce a playwright who wrote this play 30 years ago, that's coming at the expense of a new playwright who has a play right now about a issue that is current, that is not getting produced. And I think that perpetuates a culture of exclusion in the theater world. All of those ideas kind of like went into my, I don't want to do theater anymore as well, because I just noticed that the plays that I was auditioning for and the parts that I was getting, they didn't speak to me on a deeper level. And even if I did find them like philosophically, compelling, because I can talk about any story and be like engaged in it, just feel like the intellectual exercise of it. But if I didn't find it like spiritually meaningful, I didn't want to do it. And I think before then I always felt like I had to do it. I had to do it because this is the industry that I'm in, and this is sort of like the price that I need to pay if one day I'll be able to do the work that I want to do. And I kind of had this epiphany that I do the work regularly that I want to do with improv, and I'm able to supplement my income substantially by teaching improv. And so let me just focus all of my effort there for this moment, and maybe there will be a moment in the future when I pick up a script again.
Just to close the potential thread, was the play that you're referring to Larry Kramer's Normal Heart by any chance?
Normal Heart. Normal Heart. Thank you for Googling that. I'm ashamed that I didn't know. There's also a movie with Mark Ruffalo inspired by the Normal Heart.
I've never seen or heard of anything like this. This seems to only be happening to gay men.
You're accusing the government of a conspiracy to murder all gay men?
Yes.
You can't stop fighting for the ones you love.
They're going to cancel our health insurance. They're going to put us into camps. They're going to quarantine us.
That's the other thing too. It's like, why are we producing a play when there's a movie adaptation of it? I don't like. We could be sharing a news story with the world,
right?
Instead of this like well-documented story. I don't get it.
I've often wondered that, because I mean, people are doing it. I don't know why a regional theater would necessarily do it. The playwright wants it because it's financially beneficial for them to, maybe. But I think when there is something else out that's, like you said, well documented, do we really need it again? That was the reason people redid plays maybe 20 years ago, is that there wasn't as much documentation. But now, I mean, do we really? Are they really going to be doing Hamilton in high schools or colleges? Probably not, because we can all just watch it on Disney Plus with the original cast.
I do think they will be doing Hamilton in high schools sooner than later. I think that's going to be a staple of the high school repertoire for sure.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. I do think that there is a potentially harmful side effect of doing material that is a little bit dated, which is it subliminally tells the audience that the issue or the theme that this play focuses on is no longer relevant, or it's been solved, right? So when you look at The Normal Heart and you watch it today, a contemporary audience member might watch it and think, well, the problem of AIDS has been solved. The problem of AIDS has not been solved for most people. And the HIV continues to affect many people's lives detrimentally, and in particular, the Black queer community, Black trans community, people of color, and people in developing nations, right? So just because we are past this moment of the 1980s and early 1990s, where HIV was, for lack of a better word, colorblind and also like untreatable, totally untreatable. It was sort of like a death sentence. We are past that moment, but it doesn't mean that.
Right.
Yeah, right. And so I think someone might watch it and sort of like it promotes a little bit of like complacency or lack of engagement with the current social justice struggle of the community that it is elevating, because it feels like it's putting it on a shelf, like a shelf in history.
Yeah, we handled that.
Same thing with like August Wilson, right? August Wilson does all these phenomenal plays about the Black American experience. All of the time, August Wilson is produced. And potentially it has the impact for audience members of thinking that we're living in a post-racial society. Hopefully after 2020, it's very clear that is not true. But for many people it still feels true.
Right. No, I mean, that's the thing. The last year, there were a number of people who would say like, but didn't we deal with racism when we elected Obama? And it's like, do you really think that was the only problem? And did you also not hear all the racists saying things about Obama when he was president? And also, did you hear anything Trump said the last 4 years? Because it was still pretty racist. Not every single comment. I'm sure someone would be like, not everything he said was racist, Jason, so your whole point is wrong. Let's have a good faith talk, people. But no, you make a very good point that seeing old things can be good in the sense of knowing where we were. But if we are engaging with those things in such a way where we say like, that dealt with this, now let's just go back to quote unquote normal, then it still dismisses the issue and acts like it's not a problem now. And it very much still affects people now. I mean, people still, I was thinking this the other day, that queer teenagers are probably feel a lot more open to come out now than they did when I was a teenager. However, they still feel the need to come out in a way, and come out, and that in coming out, it's still very not traumatic all the time, but I mean, there's a lot of fear in coming out still. And that shows that while we have made some steps forward, this is not a thing we have completely figured out, obviously, as a society. If someone even feels the need to come out and is afraid to come out, I mean, that shows us where we are.
Right. Because when you're coming out, you're coming out because you are hiding in the closet, and we still live in a society that makes people feel like they need to hide. You know, ideally, we wouldn't need to hide. And even if when you were a young person or going through puberty or whatever, if you said, you know, I'm curious about this, that isn't sort of, that doesn't mean that you need to like claim that identity for the rest of your life.
Right.
But we can't have open and honest conversations about sex and gender, which makes people feel like they need to hide parts of themselves.
Right.
Which is sad. But you're absolutely right. People do feel more empowered to come out, which is great. And there's more support and there's more representation. I was recently watching a cartoon called Young Justice, which is like the Young Justice League. And I was very surprised that a few of the characters were openly queer, and that there was like a male on male kiss, and there was a female on female kiss, and in like a children's show. And I like teared up watching it, because like if it wasn't clear from our Star Trek conversation, was a really big nerd growing up. And I think another reason why I felt closeted for so long was because I didn't see any positive representation of queer people on screen. You know, I wanted to be like Batman. I wanted to be like Han Solo.
I love you.
I know.
I wanted to be like Captain Picard, who all had these like epic heterosexual romances and other virtues, but you never really saw a virtuous, heroic, epic queer character. And so to see that in a cartoon, it made me so happy, and really grateful that a younger generation, the generation behind me, is going to have those representations.
Yeah, I'm glad too. I'm curious. So you started Bird City a few years ago, in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're a founder, and I'm curious how much of what we've been talking about played a role into your starting Bird City. Did it play a role at all, or is it something that is a part of who you are, so therefore it's how you express improv and teach improv, but maybe it's not necessarily what made you start the theater? I mean, which of those is true?
Originally, so in late 2017, I applied for the artistic director position of a theater. And I prepared like so hard for my interview. I outlined like a concept package for the season, was talking about, an educational plan. I did all of this sort of work into, thinking about how the Baltimore improv community could transform and continue to grow. And a lot of those ideas, the seeds of the ideas for Bird City were sort of laid in that concept design. And I didn't get the position, and I told myself that if I didn't get the position, that I would offer myself a consolation prize. And I wasn't sure exactly what that would look like at first. And it ended up being founding Bird City Improv, just like deciding, I'm going to do my own thing. And I also decided to go to Chicago for 5 weeks to do the IO intensive, which was amazing. I met so many people from all around the world. They still chat with. Plus, it was just cool being able to experience that piece of history, improv history, because, Truth and Comedy was like the first improv book that I read. Horrible book. We're not a really great book. There's so many better improv textbooks.
There really are now. I mean, at the time of my reading it, it was the only one.
Right. Yeah.
So
for long form. Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But there are definitely now so many books that I point people towards because they either explain certain things a little better, or they just get to the point a little more, or they go a little deeper in other areas.
Right. So originally, I was just going to have Bird City Improv focus on community workshops and corporate engagement as sort of a way to supplement my income, because I still wanted to be supportive of the Baltimore Improv Group. They were experiencing a period of growth at the time, and I didn't want to, in my head, I was like, I don't want to be their competition. And I still taught with them and performed there, and I wanted to continue to support them. And so I did, and I actually regret that decision. I regret that decision a lot. I had mentioned to the managing director and the education director at the time that I was going to start teaching classes, and they said, oh, well, if you start teaching classes with Bird City Improv, around the city, that I wouldn't be able to teach at Baltimore Improv Group anymore. I wouldn't be able to. They didn't explicitly say I wouldn't be able to perform, right? And I think they would have still allowed me to perform. Like, it didn't seem like that sort of that was being communicated, but it felt like I was being pressured to, continue supporting Big. And so that's what I chose to do. And then in 2020, like many theaters around the country, there was some calling out of the powers that be for racial inequity and gender inequity and other forms of inequity. And I left the organization, and so did like 50 plus other people. I think 60 people total left the organization. And the High Wire Improv Theater, which is also Baltimore based, was formed. And I kind of went back to the Bird City Improv drawing board and said, how can I revamp and reimagine this to be more community focused and less about just offering workshops and corporate engagements, and more about offering community focused classes. And so then in December of 2020, I relaunched Bird City Improv's education program. I talked to some other local improvisers and some improvisers around the nation too, who would be interested in teaching, and got like a teaching staff together. And now we've been offering consistent pay what you choose online classes since December, and it's been going really well. So that's the history of Bird City Improv to date.
Very cool. When it comes to that focus, how you reimagine things, what is sort of the purpose beyond? I understand that it's more community focused, but how did you make it more community focused?
Right. So I'm thinking how do I strategize this answer? How do I lay out the logic of this answer? I guess I'll just say the core value is access, right? Mm-hmm. And I've always been really interested in access, and even before all of this, I would offer, free community workshops through Bird City Improv, through different community organizations. And so I wanted to make sure that it was accessible and that barriers to entry were decreased for anyone that wanted to take an improv class. And so I made sure to prioritize flexible pricing, right? Sort of like a pay what you choose tiered pricing system. It's like, this is the full price ticket. This is flex price 1, flex price 2. Here are some scholarships if you're BIPOC, scholarships if you're LGBT, scholarship if you just need financial assistance, right? This is just like a free ticket. And so making sure that there are all of those options available for every single one of Bird City Improv's offerings. I also wanted to make sure that I looked at improv pedagogy, right? Like, how is improv taught, and how can improv be taught in a way that is very inclusive of any individual that walks into that improv space, where they feel like they can show up as their complete and whole self. And I think that means upfront, really openly and honestly talking about oppression and talking about problematic humor, not just having it be this occasional topic when someone says something really, really horrible, but talk about it every single class. And so in every single class at every single level, we're talking about consent, consensual touch, consensual topics. We are talking about stereotypes and how stereotypes show up in humor. We'll look at different sketches or different scenes online, and we'll talk about problematic humor that might be mentioned in this sketch, or how this sketch is very socially conscious because it's punching up, it's attacking systems of power. And like I said, I'm really interested in dramatic improv too. So making sure that drama and non-comedic styles of performance are incorporated as well into every single class, so that people can sort of get a more expansive view of what improv can be. And I also wanted to make sure that I was centering anti-oppression, right, in every single one of my classes, where it's not just like we say, we're inclusive of person X, Y, or Z, or you're welcome, right? It's not just like tolerating, but it's actively combating the systems that oppress certain people, certain communities. And so what that might mean is taking a decolonized look at history and at improv history. So when we talk about the history of improv and sketch, it usually goes something like once upon a time, Viola Spolin, then Del Close, then Keith Johnstone, and then Amy Poehler, the end, right? Like that's sort of like the very brief improv history. And that leaves out some, and maybe they mention Commedia dell'arte, which is insane to me because Commedia dell'arte was like in the 1300s. And it's like, are you saying that nothing happened? Nothing happened in between? It wasn't I think it was the 1500s, but still hundreds of years passed and there wasn't a single innovation in performance. Like, why is this part of your improv history? And also, Commedia dell'arte was barely improvised. I mean, sure, they might have improvised the dialogue regularly, but the scenarios, the plot, it was all laid out. So that just totally blew my mind. But decolonizing history would say like making sure that we include, for instance, like minstrelsy. Minstrelsy is not talked about in improv like ever explicitly. Maybe it will be mentioned when someone says something racist or when a white improviser tries to horrible avail. But typically, like minstrelsy isn't talked about. And minstrelsy was the very first theatrical art form invented in the United States post-colonization. It was from 1830s to 1920, right? That's 90 years. 90 years it was very popular, and it didn't just go away after that. Like minstrelsy continued all through the 20th century. Billy Crystal was at the Oscars in blackface in 2012, I think.
Billy, is Biebs the young Sinatra or my nuts?
Oh, Sammy, stop it.
You might.
Well, yeah, I mean, and there's... Just to address that part, I mean, because people in the last year have also pointed out Jimmy Fallon as Chris Rock 20 years ago on SNL.
Man, oh man, read this book. I've seen Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and guess what? Not a lot of black folks on the show. Not a lot of black folks on the show.
Right.
And, you know, I was 21 when I remember that sketch, and I was 21, and so that means I grew up on seeing Billy Crystal in the 80s doing Sammy Davis Jr. And that sort of stuff at that time was, I mean, a lot of people didn't complain about it. I didn't hear complaints about it. And the reason there weren't complaints about it is, I think partially because like if you hear older black people defend Jimmy Fallon's thing, what is said is, but that's not a pejorative impression of, or that's not a pejorative, stereotypical characterization of black people. That was an impression of a specific person. And that's how they were getting away with that for 20, 30 years. But the thing that people don't realize is, like, people who are 60 grew up seeing real, old school, manipulative kind of minstrelization or blackface. But, you know, young people today, people in their 20s, they did not grow up on that at all. They didn't even grow up seeing Billy Crystal doing that. So, of course, it's going to be jarring when they find out about it, when they see this stuff, because, you know, young people, they have only grown up in a world where that's wrong, where any of it is wrong. So, I mean, we have to adjust, right? You know, like, it's fine to acknowledge that one is intentionally malicious and the other is not. But that doesn't mean that the other can't still have a negative impact today that it didn't have at the time. And I think it still points out that was minstrelization. That's still what that is. That's still like a byproduct of blackface. And so, you know, while the intent at the time may have been different, it's still just something we have a different filter on now.
Yeah. And I think it's really important that those topics are talked about. If you're going to study humor, if you're going to study performance, we need to be aware of that history and teach identity conscious casting, not only in our films and theater, but in our improv scenes and in our sketch, right? Like, we need to make sure that we are identity conscious, and you can only change something once you've acknowledged like where you've been and how history is impacting the present moment. And I think there's a disconnect for a lot of people. And so when we teach this really reduced white version of improv history, That's extremely problematic. And so it isn't just like mentioning minstrelsy, right? But it's also making sure that we define improv in a way that is inclusive of the many different lineages of improv. So I subscribe to a definition of improv that is finding potential in whatever is readily available. That's the definition that I like the most. Someone said something similar to me once. I forget who it was, but I thought, yeah, that's it. And I like that because it's inclusive of all different styles, and especially like Afro-diasporic improvisation, which created literally all of American music, right? Reggae, hip hop, jazz, R&B, the blues, all of those things have an improvisational origin, and many of those things still have a improvisational aesthetic or sort of like improvisational subgenre within it. And we don't necessarily make space to talk about those things. I don't even think we make space to talk about how kind of like the sister genre of stand-up comedy can be improvisational or is improvisational, and how historically Black people and people of color have found more access to comedy through stand-up, because there wasn't this ridiculous pricing model to get into an improv class. There's a really, really great book called Community and Inequality in Comedy. Behind the Laughs, that's the main title, Behind the Laughs. It's by this man named Michael P. Jeffries, and he talks about the field of comedy in terms of sketch, stand-up, and improv, and how the opportunity structures or the systemic structures within each one of those fields are different, and but all of them skew towards rewarding maleness, whiteness, heteronormativity. And it's not like I just unload all of this stuff like at the beginning of every single improv class. I'm not like, all right, everyone, welcome to history class. But I make sure that throughout the lesson plan, right, as we're talking about different exercises or when different topics come up, I'm making sure that I am prepared and other people are prepared to talk about those topics in a way that is informed and conscientious, and that's advocating for a change in the improv and theater community.
That's dope, and I love it. Now, we have had a really great conversation. It's already at the end of the episode. I don't know how. I'm going to have you on again because I've loved talking to you.
Thank you.
Now it's time to create something together.
Okay.
And we've been talking so much about how to be equitable in our comedy and also the way we run theaters, and in particular to people who are subjugated, like just being mindful of that in classes. And there's a lot of talk in comedy where people will say something that's really kind of ridiculous, which is like, oh, you can't say anything anymore and stuff like that. And I'm sure a lot of teachers who've tried to address these matters have run into comments like that. So I'm wondering how maybe we could coach instructors or even students to express or receive this kind of information. Is there a way that we can break that down quickly?
What I tell my students is the phrase, "it's just a joke," is never an acceptable excuse for causing harm. Now, if you don't understand how harm is being caused, then that's a conversation that we can have, right? If you don't understand your own privilege, if you don't understand what systemic oppression is, if you don't understand the history of a certain abuse in the theater industry and the comedy industry, then we can talk about that and hopefully come to a deeper understanding or a new understanding.
Right. And I too hate it when people say it's just a joke, because yes, the person was joking. That only speaks to their intent. Like, they didn't have a malicious intent. But that doesn't mean it can't still hurt somebody or offend somebody.
Right. And it's just a joke is the most simple way that comedians gaslight other people.
Yeah.
And that is harmful, right?
Yeah.
If you say something offensive to me and I say, hey Jason, I think what you said was like on stage, it was kink shaming, or it was homophobic, or it felt kind of sexist, whatever. If I say that to you and you say, Tavish, it's just a joke, you are trying to make me feel insane for having a hurt feeling, right? You're like, it's this weird, in just a few syllables, psychological manipulation that happens between a defensive comedian and an audience member. It was just a joke. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that some people aren't oversensitive and just need to sort of like release their butthole. I think a lot of people need to release their buttholes about a lot of things.
There's certain things maybe that a person can adjust to, like maybe they are being a little... a lot of things online, people are bringing this stuff up in bad faith. They're not actually trying to have a genuine conversation.
Right.
There are people who are genuinely upset or offended by things, and they're just bringing it to a comedian's attention.
Yeah. How would you address another player or a student who maybe didn't quite understand why they couldn't say something? Or
I think I would first try to understand where they're coming from. I mean, if somebody, like when you said, it's just a joke, that is like you literally hand waved. So that's obviously being dismissive. So if I see that, then I automatically know this person is completely dismissing me.
Right.
Or if someone were to say to me, I didn't like your joke, I wouldn't wave like that. But if I was the one offended and I brought it up to somebody and they say, oh, how? Because I wasn't trying to say this offensive thing, the layers that are offensive. I was actually trying to say this other thing and just have a little fun with that. And that's when I can say, okay, I know what your intent was. The way it was approached doesn't express that. Because, I mean, so much of comedy, especially when we're talking about stand-up, where it's like written, and it's all about language that we're using. So I'm not trying to get nitpicky with people, but I am trying to say, you're trying to communicate something, and it wasn't clear. And so I try to come at it that way, where I'm letting them know that I understand that they're not a bad person, and I'm not calling them a bad person, and I'm not trying to blast it over the internet so this person can't get another gig. I'm simply saying the thing that you're trying to do, you're not successfully doing.
Yes. I think a lot of people have weaponized cancel culture to just shame people. And cancel culture is about, holding people accountable, right? Which it's supposed to be a good thing, but it's sort of like taken on this other form of you don't see the world exactly as I see it, or your ignorance offends me, and so now I'm going to make you feel like a trash human.
Yeah, it just seems like everyone talking on the internet is, whether they're for or against it, there's so much bad faith going into the discussion that is really infuriating me these days.
Yes. It makes me so... I'm not a person that engages on social media very often, especially like in the comment section of a post. But I see that so many people love doing it and love doing it about really heated topics. And it feels like the worst medium to have these very sensitive and vulnerable and consequential conversations. I guess it's good that they're being had in any space, but I think like approaching it in that
tribal, cultish sort of way.
Yeah, tribal, cultish, shaming way. It's not great.
I feel like there is a defensiveness on all sides almost, because there's certain subject matters that are very sensitive for the subjects of those matters. And I can understand when something's brought up and a person is like, oh, are they just bullying me like everyone else does? Or not, you know? And then when comics are called out, then they kind of only see the onslaught of attention. And so they're getting defensive about that instead of getting sort of simplifying it and saying, like, instead of looking at it as a million different people saying something to you, look at it as this one thing is being said about the comedy bit I did.
Right.
Because that makes it simpler to take in. I think emotionally people just aren't able to deal with the onslaught. And I don't think we're built that way. But you have to be able to say, okay, what did I say? What did I mean? And how did people take it? And if people took it differently than what the words I used directly express, then maybe you can say they're wrong. But chances are you probably expressed it a little off if people are taking it differently, you know? I mean, I'm very case by case, but I mean, a comedian really can't just dismiss it. And it's just, you know, you have comedians that'll say, oh, it's cancel culture when it's really just someone being held accountable for something legitimately wrong they did, like no gray area. And then you have people who are making so much noise and they're doing it in a bad faith way, and they're not actually trying to get someone to address something in an appropriate manner. They're just trying to bash that person. And that's not helpful either, because it doesn't lead that person to understanding, because shame doesn't work.
Right. And it's like this self-exaltation, right? It's like I'm raising myself above you. I am morally superior to you. And that's like this really grand irony, because the idea of superiority is like, just at its most essential, is what is often causing these abuses and this ignorance and this oppression. It's that feeling of superiority. And so now you're coming into this conversation armed with that same feeling of superiority, instead of humbling yourself a little bit, because presumably every single one of us has had many learning moments throughout our lives. You know, I used to say some horrible things. I used to do some horrible things. I used to believe some things that I am not proud that I believed.
Right.
And
I mean, there's always something. Yeah. I mean, everybody, because it was so culturally considered okay to joke about, was to use the R word.
Right.
Or another thing that was really culturally accepted 20 years ago was to be like, oh, that's gay.
Yeah.
You know, like that was, I mean, I've even heard gay people do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've heard even gay people do that because it was so culturally acceptable, and maybe they were playing into what you were talking about early on in the discussion of how they need a code switch so they feel like they belong to the group. But gosh, I mean, obviously
I still say that's gay, but to my other gay friends as sort of like this inside joke. It makes me chuckle, but it also makes me wonder if straight people do the same thing. You know?
There are different things that maybe people do. I know that like black people, we use the N-word to each other, you know, and that's a similar thing.
Right. But I'm wondering if, like, you know, because like I feel comfortable around other gay people, right? So I might make like a clearly homophobic joke through sort of like the lens of irony, and then we laugh about it. And I feel okay about that because I was the recipient of that kind of
everyone
bullying.
does that. Everyone does that to some extent, in some way.
Yeah.
They're making effed up jokes out of irony with their best friends because their best friends know that everyone there knows, well, this is wrong, and I'm kind of making a joke about how wrong it is.
But I wonder if people actually do know that, because I think some people understand that they're not supposed to say it, but they don't understand why it's wrong.
I'm sure that's true for a lot of people. I guess I'm sort of surrounded by good people. So like,
Yeah.
they're the ones that I know when I do it, it's there. We all know that like I'm saying
Yes.
something outlandish for the sake of saying something outlandish, and it's kind of
Yes.
like a way to blow off steam. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's also something that in a serious discussion we would never say. You know, like
Yeah. Good.
But yeah, I think there are some comics who do that. And are trying to do that with just everybody, and some people pull it off and some people don't. But you know, I think kind of to go back to what we were talking about, I think some of this discussion would be the sort of after class at the bar sort of learning experience, but in improv, or even if I was teaching a stand-up class, you'd kind of have to mention how difficult it is to do some of these things and it come across the intended way if you don't have any harm. But you can tell when a person definitely means harm or is just like does not care. And those times you just need to, I would just call it out flatly as wrong. And if they have a problem with it, then I would say, well, quite frankly, it's your problem and you don't need to make it anyone else's problem. But when somebody stumbles into it and they didn't mean it and they just thought, oh, I thought this was a benign violation and not like an actual violation, I'm so sorry. That's the situation. Or even if they're like, wait, but I thought this was acceptable because I've seen comics do it before. That's the time when I think that can get in a little gray area, because some people say that and it's really like they're hiding behind something and they actually were malicious. But for the ones who are not being malicious, then I would say it's just an adjustment we got to make. You know, like it's give yourself some time to adjust. I'm not saying you're an evil person. I'm not saying the thing you did was so evil and everyone in this class needs to get you booted out of here. I'm just saying it's something that you have to adjust to. And it's an easy adjustment, quite frankly.
And it's so important, I think, to have that atmosphere in an improv classroom or a rehearsal space. For years now, the first lesson of almost every single class I end up teaching is, like, let's embrace failure. Let's celebrate failure because it's a sign that we're learning. And I think for these more hot button topics, it's no different, right? Like we can still, like, yes, we're going to acknowledge that what you just said might have been harmful or offensive or problematic in some way. We're going to acknowledge that, but we're also going to like embrace and celebrate the fact that we're having a learning moment together. And then last thought is my friend Blue Cavella-Lett, an improviser in Baltimore. I was talking to her the other week and she was talking about the importance of calling someone in before calling them out, but how a lot of people feel compelled to immediately get on the megaphone or to go on Facebook and call someone out. And really, it's not going to solve things in the long term. It might make you feel a little bit better in the moment, but in the long term, we need to have dialogue with people and difficult dialogue with people, which means very compassionately and kindly calling someone in and saying, hey, this is what I saw you do. You know, I don't think that you meant anything by it, but here is why what you just did was problematic. And see, like, what questions do they have? Like, do they get it? Some people get it right away and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. Other people, they'll be confused, or like you said, they'll say, well, someone else did something very similar. And then we get to have a deeper conversation around that topic. But just assuming the worst of the person immediately and deciding that you are morally superior and that the whole world needs to know about this one mistake that this person made in a very public and shameful forum. I just don't get that. I get it, but I don't like it.
There it is. Thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing all this with me. This one means a lot. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much for having me on.
I love that so much. Call someone in before you call them out. So much of calling people out online is performative. It's not allyship. But if you call someone in, you're actually trying to get them to change. Love that so much. Thank you to whoever said that to Tavish, and to Tavish for sharing it and everything else that he shared with us today. And big thanks to Brian James O'Connell for connecting us. Be sure to check out Bird City online, birdcityimprov.com, and on Instagram and Facebook, follow them at Bird City Improv. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at There It Is Pod. Follow me on Instagram at Jason Farpix and Twitter at Jason Farjokes. And go to thereitispod.com. We've got a new Fest blog up. Until next time, be good to each other.
The music for the theme song was created by Neil Brooks. The rap was written and performed by Nick Acevedo. The logo for There It Is was created by Jeff Prater. The There It Is podcast is produced by Jason Farr.